in real life. Welcome to the Fully Human Connections podcast. I'm joined by Reggie Marr and Dr. Kristen Eccleston. Did I pronounce it correctly?
Yes, Eccleston. It's a mouthful.
Well, thank you all for joining me today on this Fully Human Connections podcast. And the purpose of the podcast is really to talk about how to really make fully human connections in today's world. That's really where this idea came from. Reggie's a partner with Kent, who we started this, Kent Frazier. We started the Fully Humans Connections podcast with. They have a company called Fully Human. And I thought when I heard their company name, I said, that to me should be the quest of everybody to become fully human. And our goal is really to explore during these podcasts what it means to be fully human. And within that, making fully human connections with ourselves first and then with others as well. So kind of with that being said, as our initial starting point, in today's world, in news and the media, let's start with this because Reggie has written a book. Reggie, would you mind sharing the title of your book again and the theme of your book? Because we're going to segue from that into what I see as false narratives by the media.
Yeah, so thanks for that, King. Yeah, so the title of the book, and it's forthcoming. It's in October. The title is Healing America's Narratives, and the subtitle is The Feminine, the Masculine, and Our Collective National Shadow. And the basic premise is that we have multiple we have a big narrative in America held by many people that's based in a lot of myth and kind of whitewashed history. And we have this denial of much of our history and much of our current events, and what I would describe as the underlying unhealthy masculine, which has dominated our history, and a yearning for what I would call the healthy feminine, which is sadly lacking in much of our history. And I won't say too much more about that because we get into discussion of man, woman, masculine, feminine. It gets kind of murky. But basically, healing the narratives amid all of the polarization, the things like the country is run by a bunch of sex trafficking pedophiles, things like that, which people actually believe is a big issue. And I believe that getting into the storytelling, in the best meaning of that word, telling stories that are in fact provable, based on some level of fact and evidence, is one way into this. So I'll just put a period there, and because I could, as I've said to King before, I could talk for the whole hour on the book, and that wouldn't be the right thing to do here.
And before we really get into our discussion, Dr. Eccleston, would you mind kind of giving a brief bio yourself, kind of the context, then we'll kind of get involved in our discussion.
Sure. So my background specifically is in education, specifically mind, brain, and teaching. So essentially the neuroscience behind how we learn, how we process information, how our brain takes information in, and then how our experiences in our environment also influence how our brain processes that information. I specifically work with families, with students with mental health needs, and that's kind of my passion and my background. But really the neuroscience behind how we learn, how we process information, and how we think is a little bit of my background.
Well, thank you all both for that introductions. So now with that context being set, what I want to discuss was starting off with what I see as being these false narratives in the media. And what I mean by false narratives in the media, I mean, there's several narratives to choose from. But in particular, what I want to kind of start our conversation off with is the narrative of what I believe the false narrative around race. And what I mean by that is the media paints it that we're all monolithic based on the race that we have, or even the other tribes they put us in, whether it's race, gender, ethnicity, age, sexual orientation, whatever the tribes we are pushed into, that we're monolithic in that thought, that all white people think one way, all black people think one way. And that's really a very false narrative. Like all women, white women think one way and all black women think one way. And again, that's another false narrative. So my question, I would start with you, Dr. Eccleston, and I want to kind of frame it in this way. I just acquired a dog within the last 10 days. And I've been watching a ton of videos on pretty much how to train my dog and really understand how my dog thinks and understand the behaviors. And so lately I got turned to a video that really taught about how to associate clicking sounds with treats and commands at the same time to really control the behavior. So now with that being said, is that something that can be done for humans to a certain extent as far as getting them to behave in a certain way based on training or education? Let me say it in that context.
Absolutely, it can. It's kind of that theory of Pavlov's dog, and that definitely applies to humans as well. In conditioning, I mean, you hear things like brainwashing, you hear things about conditioning, grooming, and those things are all traits, right? You know, we have morals and we have values here in this country versus other countries, but that's all because we were brought up a certain way to believe that this is what is accurate, this is what's true, this is what's right. I mean, I think that there is always a fine line between right and wrong because it's all perceived on how you see something, how you perceive it to be accurate or to be reflective of your values and your personal biases and your life experiences. And I think that happens very much so in the media. And the way the media does that is they do this through sensationalism. They do this through always really pointing out the negatives. I'm sure we can all agree that most of the news, if you turn on the news, is highlighting all of the really bad things that are happening and never really touching on the really wonderful stories that are happening or the positive things that are happening in this world. And what's scary about that is us as humans, we are evolved individuals, we are higher level thinking individuals, but we do have brains that are still somewhat connected to that primitive aspect of who we were as early humans. And our sole purpose is to survive. Our brain's decisions that it makes is because it is trying to keep us alive and we are trying to survive. So negative things are much more impactful to us than positive things. It goes back to that old adage, if you went to the watering hole and a lion showed up, right? You knew, okay, I might not want to go back to that watering hole because I have the chance of being eaten, right? Your brain wanted to remember that because it wanted to increase your chance of survival. Well, the same thing is happening with negative aspects in the media as well, is you are being exposed to all these negative things and your brain is remembering that because it wants to survive. So it starts to paint these narratives and these stories in your mind in order to keep you from having to experience uncomfortable change, to having to experience anything that might impact you negatively. So that's one of the ways that I think media manipulates a lot of us, is through those negative sensationalism stories, because it's programming our brains essentially to recall those things and have certain feelings and views towards those things because they're more impactful to us than positive information.
Excellent. And Reggie, did you want to address that? Because if not, I have a question I want to ask you that's similar in that context, but I want to give you an opportunity if you want to respond.
Yeah, I'll just respond really quickly. So I love, I agree. What I refer to the things I'm born with, the thing each of us is born with, based on family of origin, everything that's present, including geography and chronology. So I was born in 1954. It's different than being born in 2014 for a lot of reasons, what I was given. And I call those cultural givens. And I believe that healthy adolescence is the time when we begin to challenge everything that we're given. And it's up to us as potential adults, developmental adults, not just chronological adults, to challenge what we're given. And those things that hold up, we can keep and embrace because they make sense for whatever reason, and to let go those things we were given that don't really hold up against scrutiny. And yeah, so I just wanted to add, I agree with what Dr. Eccleston said. And I think that's an important move. The question, which I always wrestle with, is what it is that allows or invites many of us to do that questioning.
Can I actually, before you ask your next question, can I
Absolutely.
jump
Yeah.
on that? So I think that's a great question, Reggie. And I actually think that is the question. It's that level of awareness. And King, when we've talked in the past, I talked about this concept of you don't know what you don't know. And that is essentially what hinders us. You have to have this level of awareness that you don't know everything, or you haven't been exposed, that you do have personal biases, and those are shaping your narrative, but they may not be the end all be all. There might be more. And it's that difference to me between people who have that awareness of they don't know everything and that they're seeking to understand more perspectives, or they're seeking to understand other people's experiences and use that to keep evolving their knowledge. And then there's people who think that I know everything that I'm ever going to need to know, and I don't need to go beyond that. And I think that's where we get stuck. There's people who are open to always evolving their knowledge, and people who are stuck. And it's the difference between that awareness of I don't know everything versus I think I know everything.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And speaking of which, I want to throw both of you all this question. Now, when it comes to, because Reggie, you're a teacher, if that's correct.
I began as a high school teacher and basketball coach and a college adjunct. Yeah, so that was several lifetimes ago. But yeah, so I began, and I consider myself an educator. That's been my profession, my way of making, getting food and getting a roof over my head. So yeah.
So here's my question for you both. Given today's climate, what is the difference between the way Generation X was raised compared to how millennials and even Generation Zs are growing up in this environment where, again, I grew up as a Generation X in a world where there was violence on TV, but not as much. And then we got into the violence in video games, and we would play that. Then we had the violence in our music, but we were kind of all able to kind of compartmentalize that into fantasy games or whatever, movies. What I'm seeing, and I just want to see what you all's thoughts on it, is that what I'm seeing from Generation Zs and Generation Millennials, they don't seem to be able to compartmentalize that violence as much. Do you think that's intentional from a conditioning standpoint, or that's just generationally something has changed in the way they're processing, or just what are your thoughts overall on that difference?
So I'll just jump in really quickly. So I don't think it's one of those or the other. I think it's my best guess, and I don't know the answer, but my best guess is that it's all of that and some things we haven't figured out yet. One of the researchers I trust with regard to the different generations, and she wrote mostly research. That's probably not true. The most recent book has been focused on iGen, okay, the internet generation, or that's Generation Z, I believe. Jean Twenge, and she just points to the impact, especially from 2012 or so forward. These were the first generation to grow up with the world in their hands, with the phone in their hands. I'm being a little bit sardonic there, and we're still discovering the impact. We know some of the negatives already, but we're still discovering the impact of that. So I think technology plays a role. To answer your question, King, more directly, I think generations play a role. Again, just so I'm a boomer. I'm 8 years after the end of World War II, I entered the planet. And so the cultural givens, my cultural givens were, I'll just say a couple of them. The Japanese were bad people. The Germans were bad people. They were trying to redeem themselves. Slavery was bad, but Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. And it was a real kind of superficial view of the world. One true church, the Catholic Church. So I could go on and on. The only one that holds up is that the Yankees were the best baseball team based on the number of World Series that they won. And I joke that that's the only one that was really still holds up, but that's kind of a throwaway. And one other one, reading books was a good thing to do. I was given that as a kid. And so two things I was given hold up. The rest of them were well-intentioned, but not based in evidence or myth. So I think it's a real overdetermined, multifaceted, complex reason for the differences in how violence is being perceived. And I would be really reticent to say it's this and not that. And plus, that's not my area of expertise. So, yeah.
I agree with everything Reggie said. If I was going to add anything on there, I would say that I agree. I think there's more than just one thing. There's so many different things you could put your finger on and say that this has been a contributing factor. I think technology, as Reggie said, is a major one of those things. I think that children have been desensitized to a degree too, versus since they've always had, technology right at their fingertips and they've been able to see things news-wise, media-wise. Bad things have always been happening, but I think there's a different level of awareness of those bad things happening now versus, several decades or generations ago where news media, social media wasn't as readily available. So you weren't as aware of some of the things that were going on. And unfortunately, as great as it is to be informed and be aware, you also become desensitized. I mean, unfortunately, the more school shootings that happen, I remember when Columbine happened, that was like, mind explode, like, how could this happen? And even though it's still upsetting every time it happens, I don't feel like we have the same level of reaction. It's one of those, oh, here's another one of those unfortunate events happening. And because we've become desensitized to things. And I feel like that has been a big impact on the generations. And I also feel like for whatever reason, this most recent generation has parents, so I guess that would be Gen X and elder millennial parents who, for whatever reason, we have really held on to those feelings of insecurities or pain that we had with kids. And we have really tried to push upon our children, protecting them from those feelings. And I've noticed with the younger generations, there's a lack of resiliency and perseverance there, because I think for whatever reason, the elder millennials and Generation X have really wanted to protect their children from having to feel some of the discomforts that we had to feel, just normal things like peers being mean, peers doing certain things, not winning awards or not being first place. And we've wanted to protect our children from having to feel those feelings of disappointment. And there's a great book, and I want to say it's called Nation of Wimps. But what it's talking about is when we protect children from having to experience some of those hard feelings when they're younger, when they get older and they go to college, made little things like breakups that, yeah, they stink. Breakups aren't fun, right? But they become world-shattering, world-ending for kids, almost to the point of suicide at some points with some children, because those resiliency skills aren't there, because we protected them from having to experience some of those hard feelings when they were going through their adolescence. And I have found that to be something that is also impactful. But again, it's just one of those many things that I think are contributing to the overall concern or issue.
Yeah. And King, can I just add one larger historical perspective? And this is not the only historical truth about the United States, but it's one very important one. We were built through a series of bloodbaths, beginning with kidnapping Africans, and then basically slaughtering and or removing indigenous peoples. Now we refer to them, now we're talking about African Americans and Native Americans. But when the Europeans first came over, the Americas effectively hadn't been named yet. And then we won a revolution against the monarchy, against Great Britain. Actually, that was the British against the British. We became America. And then in order to try to survive, we committed, the greatest bloodbath in our history, which was the war against the Civil War, on the war between the states. That ended, and then there was an ongoing bloodbath, especially, but not only in the South, through Reconstruction, lynching, Jim Crow. And then, just less than a century later, after the Civil War, we had World War II, World War I and World War II, and then Korea, Vietnam, etc. So one of the things that's true is that we have survived as a nation because when push comes to shove, or when we were just wanted to be preemptive, we were better at violence than the opposition. We won the wars. Now, we could argue historically, World War II and World War I, maybe that's a good thing. But if you look at the histories of Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, those chosen violences, especially Iraq, Afghanistan. You make the argument we were looking for the perpetrators of September 11th, but we've used violence to get what we want. So personally, and I'm not the only one who feels this way, but I'll just speak for myself, I'm not surprised that we have 103 gunshot deaths a day here. 2/3 are suicides, but there's still gunshot deaths. So I'm not surprised by the violence in this country, because historically we've had that as a country. Now there's a lot of reasons that immigrants still come here, even through the Trump years and anti-immigration rhetoric and things. There's still a lot of attractive, really good things about the country, but the underlying prevalence of violence as a solution has been with us since before the founding fathers, really. And I think that's important to address, not necessarily further in this conversation, but as a nation, because it's not going away by itself. And it affects everybody in various ways, but it impacts everybody.
Absolutely. I'm sorry. Are you done, Reggie?
No, yeah, I'm done. So thanks.
I mean, you bring up a good point, and I definitely want to delve into some of the historical things around war and violence. Before we move on from there, I just still want to kind of go back to the conditioning and behavior training. And the reason I want to stay there with that is this. One of my favorite authors' books is by Stephen R. Covey, and the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And it's centered around principles. So I'm a big person understanding principles, right? And I understand, to me, a universal principle is, and you all can correct me if I'm wrong with the context, but just the simplification of it is, any mammal that is not conditioned properly can become violent, or the environment can condition it, in other words. If it's not conditioning intentionally with training and education and love, then the environment that we live in can make it become violent, like a dog, right? You look at a dog that has not been properly trained, and especially a dog that's been bred to have certain behavior characteristics, and they tie into their instincts, they're going to be a very violent dog. And my point with that is, at what point do we look at and start to say to ourselves as a society that the direction we're going in with the violent movies that we all seem to love, right? With the violent music that I know that I grew up with, that's prevalent in my culture, that speaks about the conditions of our environment, but it's still violent music. That what point do we start to say that the outcome that's being produced by is free will? Well, we want the free will, but because of this outcome that's happening from it, this is the result. Mass shootings at schools, mass shootings at churches, mass shootings at supermarkets. My question is, as a society, when do we pivot to say, let's change some of the things we put out, or trying to create maybe alternative path to education and entertainment that's not so much wrapped in violence? Does that make any?
No, that makes a lot of sense. And it's funny, as I'm sitting here thinking through what you're saying, I go, this is a really complex question, because I think specifically to the example you're using of violent music, right? It was created as a way to self-express feelings of oppression and feelings of not being heard or not being seen, or being a victim, and being able to speak out against what was happening as a small culture, right? I'm thinking like NWA and like Compton and things when you're saying that. And I'm thinking how it was really used to speak out against some of the violence that was happening. But now what it has done decades later, after it's brought attention to some of what's going on, now it's kind of coming back around in that circle. And now it's fueling some of that violence that you're talking about. So it's hard, because in one sense, it was a way of expression to really expose what was happening to a small subgroup of individuals, or not small, but a subgroup of individuals. But now that we're circling back around, if we go, hey, this is really violent and we really need to tone it down, are we starting to oppress again? And I'm not saying that that's the answer. I'm just saying that those are kind of the thoughts that go through my mind, that it's a very complex question, because you're right there's things that are being done and that are occurring that are insinuating violence, and it's continuing it, or it's like going back to desensitizing children, especially who are being exposed to it, and they've lost the message. They no longer understand where that originated from and what the purpose of it was. Now they just are hearing those messages. So that's a great question, King, because to me, it's very complex, because it's like a pendulum swinging. It swung one way for a reason. And now as it starts to swing back, do we start to circle back around reasons why it was created with to begin with? Are we starting to oppress people again by not allowing them that self-expression, if it's considered self-expression? So that's a really, really good question. And I don't know that I have the best answer, but you're right. There are things that I think need to be addressed, but how we go about it to make sure that people aren't feeling like they're not able to use their voice while still being responsible. I think, to me, if anything, that's a great question too, is how do we achieve that?
Well, let me piggyback on that just a little bit more, because as you said, I grew up off that. That's my culture, my age. My favorite rappers come from NWA, Ice Cube, and I listen to them now as 50-year-old men, and the wisdom they have now compared to when they were 16 and 17 when they started off, right? But that's where I'm going with this, is that at that age, we were able to kind of compartmentalize that. We understood that this is just a movie, or this is just a song. And so we kept it in that category. I never once, as much as I listened to those songs by NWA repeatedly, still to this day, I still listen to it because I still like that music. But I never once in my mind say, I want to go out and do anything the artists are advocating in the songs, or talking about the songs. It's compartmentalized. And what I'm saying is that what I'm saying from youth, and I guess it's because I had love. I had other expressions of kindness in my life and the way I was raised, so that this wasn't my dominant thought, is where I'm going with this. Where, again, I keep using the analogy of dogs, where I see how a dog that is not properly trained right can just have this killer instinct. And when I'm seeing today's youth, when I'm talking about 15 to 16 years old, that I don't see that they see the humanity in people when they do the acts that they do. It's just, to them, it's no more a consequence of killing a human being as it is killing a character on the screen, on a video game. So that's where I'm saying it's like I don't see where things are being compartmentalized for most of the kids in today's generation.
No, I see what you're saying. So I think what you're asking is, how do we get back to that, and what kind of environmental factors need to exist in order for children to be able to compartmentalize, as you said. But I think ultimately, and I'm sorry that I'm being repetitive in this, I think it goes back to that desensitization. I think about video games when you were younger, right? I mean, the quality of what they look like compared to what you see on the screen now, the realism of it almost looks like you're watching a movie. I mean, the violence that, if you go back and you look at a lot of movies, sexual orientations that were happening, or just sexual encounters that were happening, or even the violence, a lot of it was almost inferred. And when I say inferred, it was like you didn't really see it, but you knew what was happening. So especially if young kids were exposed to it, it probably went over their heads a little bit. The adults knew what was being alluded to, and so you kind of got the context. But we don't hold back that way anymore in a lot of video games or movies. The violence or the sexual encounters are there, and they're there on full display. And some kids just don't have the psychological maturity yet to really comprehend what they're being exposed to. And I think that, again, goes back to that desensitization, that it's just normal for them. And that's why they can't separate reality versus this fantasy, because they're so immersed in it.
Yeah, and I agree with what both of you have put on the table, and I'd like to go back, to King, to something that you said, 'cause I think it's really important. You mentioned that the music you were listening to and the environment in which you were listening to, but you said you had love in your life, and I think that piece right there goes, and not just love, but love is kind of a wonderfully encompassing quality that those of us who have experienced it kind of know what you mean when you say that. And I think that goes to the difference between, combat veterans, for example, who experience war. Some come back, all of them come back with some kind of trauma, but some come back and are able to move beyond it. Some can't. Somebody who's a victim of a violent crime, somebody who was in the Holocaust, who was in the concentration camps, pick whatever traumatic event we want. Some people experience it, do their work and get through it. Some people are forever damaged and are really never fully whole again, to use a kind of a generic expression. And I think what it comes down to with what Dr. Eccleston was saying about the media today, because when I saw World War II movies, first of all, it was a black and white TV, so even if there was blood, it was gray, dark gray. I don't even know how to describe the color. But you never really saw the gore of war, and it was in some ways, because we were always winning, it glorified it. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know which of those is true, some of the best, and let's just stay with the movies for a moment, some of the best anti-war movies that have been made, I'll say in the last 40 years, post-Vietnam, are also horribly gory. But here's the point. Some people look at that and say, yeah, war is horrible. We should, if we could never have another war, that would be a great thing. Others look at it and say, that's really cool. And they're somehow attracted to the violence. And I would argue, and this is completely anecdotal, I don't have any evidence to back this up, but what you said, King, is somebody who views that with a sense of having been loved and loving other people, with a, kind of a, if not a global perspective, at least a loving perspective in their local community, their state, or their region of the country, if not the nation. If they have that experience of love, the odds are they're not going to look at an anti-war movie that shows the horrors of war, because technology now allows us to do that with make-believe things on the screen. Somebody who has that sense of love and depth is going to be turned off by it, but see its usefulness as a statement against violence. Whereas somebody who doesn't come in with the love, somebody who wasn't embraced and held and properly attached as a child, is going to see that and see it as a way out and a way to push back against an unfriendly world. So again, my bias is developmental. I think, if it's all about me, that's a healthy stage of development, but I got to move past it. Then it's all about us, whatever us means, me and my family, me and my religion, me and my nation, me and my job, my coworkers. And then it's about all of us, just, human beings. So when a baby dies in Baghdad, it hurts me as much as when a baby dies in Brooklyn. And then, the last step, as far as I know, it's about all that is. So I care about this universe, the planet, creation. That's a big step, that one. But if we could just get to, it's about all of us. All humans count. Not only in America, all humans count. And we're nowhere near that as a nation, much less a planet. And that's a developmental move. And I would argue, again, King, back to what you said, people who were loved early on have a better chance at getting there. Oh yeah, those people are human too. Their language is different, their clothing is different, their rituals are different, but they have, I always forget the number, is it 208 bones, 206, whatever it is. They have the same number of bones as I do, one nose, a mouth, 32 teeth. I have some that have been pulled, so I have fewer. But to make that connection is a really big deal. And all we have to do is look no further than Washington, D.C. And I shouldn't smile as I say this, to see that even our elected officials aren't there. Some of them are, but many of them aren't. I mean, they see each other. When they disagree now, they call each other un-American because they're having a disagreement. So I hate to be pessimistic, but we have a lot of work to do.
No, and I agree with everything you said, Reggie, especially with the work that we need to do. One thought that I might add, just to contribute to the thought process behind what you said is this idea of perception versus reality. And some of that I think is hardwired into us as individuals too. What we perceive as our reality is not always what the next person next to us perceives as their reality. And the example I'll give is, think of some siblings, right? Siblings who have grown up in the same home, and we'll even say it's a very loving home, a very supportive home, and you have a sibling who excels and does really, really well and is a really great person, and then you have another sibling who, same home, same environment, same parents, same opportunities, but maybe got really immersed in the drug culture, or really struggles or runs away from home, or has a lot of behavioral issues going on. And so I feel like I've been exposed to a lot of those scenarios before, and just in my career of who I've worked with. And so I feel like that's just one more complexity to it too, is there's a little bit of how we are just hardwired naturally too as human beings. And so even sometimes when you have opportunities and love, if you perceive yourself as not having your needs met, even though in reality maybe that you were, but your perception is you're not, then that becomes your reality, and that can create other issues in itself too. So it goes back to what I said earlier, King, that it's a complex question. It really is. There are so many angles that we can look at. I'm with you. I think if we could all just say everybody needs love, and it would make everything better, then it would be fantastic, because there are a lot of people and children who aren't getting love and support, but there are a lot of children who don't get the love and support and persevere and end up doing really, really well and are very compassionate. So a little bit of it is how we're just hardwired as human beings as well too, and that's just another complexity in this already complex question.
Absolutely. We have some comments here from Learning How. Thank you for listening, Learning How. Said the love individuals' brains are even shaped differently than those with traumatic experiences. You know, and that's where I believe that's, to me, is I would say the fuel of becoming fully human is love. Right? That's the energy, that we want to be able to create, we want to be connected to, we want to write about, we want to sing about, we want to experience, we want to share, but most of the things that are immediate, to your point earlier, Dr. Eccleston, why do you think, and I know it's for clicks, I know it's for money, but if you were to poll most people, would they rather focus on being loved or focus on being hated? Most people, I believe, would say, I want love, at a high number. So why wouldn't love be something that people would click on more or sell more than hate?
It goes back to your brain. Your brain is more attracted to those negative things because it wants to survive. And it's a subconscious thing that's happening. It's not something that I think we are consciously choosing. Your brain is more intrigued by, and I love calling this, I always call it the pretty woman theory. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Pretty Woman, but there is a scene where she's laying in bed with Richard Gere, and she's talking about kind of her trauma as when she was younger. And there was a man who had told her she was stupid or she wasn't going to amount to much. And he asked, well, why did you believe that? And she says, the negative things are always easier to believe. And that is true, because that is how our brain is structured. And so to answer your question, that is why we click on the negative things and not the things out of love. Sure, we all love a feel-good moment, but our brain is like, no, we need to know about this because we need to survive, and we need to make sure it's not impacting us negatively. And that's what attracts us. And I think to some degree, the media or the mass media knows that, and that's how it keeps us sucked in and buying into these things. I mean, think about it at the grocery store when you're looking at magazines. Most of the time, the covers aren't these fluff pieces, right? They're these like, look at this scandal or look at this romance that's falling apart. We're all attracted to the negative because our brain is more intrigued by it.
Yeah. This reminds me of, again, I keep, it shows my age now. I keep going back in time, and Reggie, I know you'll definitely understand and relate to this, being a baby boomer. But when I grew up and I watched adults in my neighborhood who were teenagers, and I was a kid, even though they were in gangs, so they might have got violent, but they would still, at the end of the day, when they gathered, some would get around a trash can and sing doo-wop love songs. right? Even though they had that gangster, we're gonna run the game, we're gonna be violent, we may steal, we may rob, we may do these things, but yet still they wanted to be singing and they wanted to sing about love. And when I'm saying that in today's generation, that's not there. It's like the violence is there all the time. In the context that, and to Reggie's point, our country, Malcolm X even once said chickens will come home to roost. But if you look at everything, every problem that we solve as a country is through violence. Not to say it's a bad country. I'm not saying that. I think America is the greatest country on the planet because we have the opportunity, to have these conversations that we have, right? And be in the businesses that we're in. But at the same time, it's looking at the context that, like, two things real quick, and I just want to pivot after I make this point. And I don't know if you all see this, but I watch a lot of TV. I grew up watching a lot of TV, so I still one of my pastimes. But I watch things that I'm more instructional to learn. But I can't watch whether it's a comedy, a horror movie, a rom-com, or whatever the theme of the movie is. Alcohol plays a major role. They're always drinking. It could be a sitcom. Someone's having a glass of alcohol, right? So, but no one ever talks about that. That never even gets mentioned. It's just like, I don't know people who always drink that much, that alcohol is that much a part of our culture as it is the Hollywood shows. So again, I only make that point because I still believe that until we understand, and you are both being educators and understanding how children work better than I do, but I'm saying that until we get to the point where we really are looking at, as an engineer, I'm always systems, outcome, consequence, this produces this outcome. You want to change the outcome, you change the behavior. To me, it's logical, right? So I'm just saying it until we get to the point where we're saying we no longer want mass shootings, then why don't we stop this action that we believe creates it? Even though I know some folks will argue that movies alone don't create the mass shootings, the music alone doesn't create the mass shootings, that video games alone doesn't create the mass shootings. But if we can agree that those elements are there, why not begin to start picking those apart to get to the real root of the problem? Is what I'm advocating.
So I can jump in on that. And what I would say is the problem is we are still doing things how they've always been done. And we have a hard time getting away from that mentality. There's this great scientific study that was done, and I'll try to tell it quickly, but they put different monkeys in a cage and they hung a banana from the middle of this cage, and there was a ladder underneath it. And every time a monkey would go to get the banana, they would spray all of the monkeys in the cage with freezing cold water. So every time one goes to get the banana, they all get sprayed with freezing cold water. One by one, they would take one of the monkeys out and put a new monkey in. And as soon as that new monkey would go to get the banana, all of the other monkeys in the cage would attack that monkey. And they would attack it because they were all afraid of getting sprayed with that freezing cold water. And one by one, they would take one out, put a new one in. And eventually there was a cage full of monkeys who had never been exposed to the freezing cold water, ever been exposed. But anytime a new one got put in and they went for the banana, they all would attack because they had learned to attack from the monkeys that had been exposed to that freezing cold water, and they wanted to stop them. And now there was a cage full of monkeys who had no idea why they were attacking this monkey at all, but that's the way it had always been done. So they're going to still attack because all they knew is that they got attacked when they were new, and they're going to keep the cycle going. But none of these monkeys know why they were doing it because none of them, they're the original monkeys that had gotten sprayed with water. And I think a lot of times that's how we are acting as a society. We are doing things the way we have always done it. And we're talking generations from hundreds of years ago. It's the way we had always done it. It's what we know. And we're too afraid to change because that's how we've always done it. And we don't even know why we are doing things the way that we are doing things anymore. Because maybe once it did serve a purpose hundreds of years ago, the way our education system was set up, whatever topic you want to get on, there was a purpose maybe when it was first set up, but it doesn't exist anymore. And we don't know why we're continuing to do things the way we're doing them. We're just doing them because that's the way it had always been done. And we don't want to get attacked by the monkeys with the bananas, right? I mean, but that's what it really comes down to. And that's kind of the psychological behind why we continue to do things, despite us realizing like, hey, I don't think this is working real well, but we're not changing it because this is how we've done things.
I agree with that conditioned response, and I would like to put a social, one other social piece to turn on this, back to the question that you asked, King, and it's one of the shadow elements that I speak about in the book, and it's greed. There's ignorance, arrogance, bigotry, a lot of things, but greed is in there. And going back to the movies, with the drinking, with the violence, with and I say movies, including television, video games, etc. I'm just going to say movies to keep it straightforward. But when you in a movie, when I don't know exactly how much or how many lobbyists the alcohol industry has in Washington, D.C. I don't know exactly how many lobbyists the gun industry has in D.C. I don't know how many. I mean, I could go on. You see where I'm going with this. Anytime you see, and sometimes it's named, sometimes it's not, but in certain television shows and movies, you'll see the brand of the alcohol on the bottle. Sometimes you won't, or the beer, whatever it is. Very often you'll hear the name of Glock or Bushmaster. Sometimes you'll see an Apple laptop. Sometimes you'll see a Dell. Sometimes you'll see whatever. All of those are paid. You watch in television movies, no director, no producer shows brands for free, right? So there's a handful of people, and I'm pretty sure that the three of us aren't among them, who get to make the calls about what appears on the screens, big screen, small screen, whatever screen it happens to be. And it all comes back to somebody is making money based on how many drinks there are. And I agree with you. I love military and cop movies and law enforcement things. I always have, because there's a sense of teamwork in them. Usually there's a sense of family or teamwork. There's a sense of, good versus evil, which is kind of, sometimes the line is vague, but I enjoy that. And inevitably they're violent and they have alcohol in them. And so that's all tied together. And because it's make-believe on the screen, it all has to do, let me rephrase that, much of it has to do with how much some company is paying to get their product put in front of our faces in this movie or TV show or video that we enjoy, that we're willing to pay for. So there's an underlying greed thing there, that none of it is by accident, and it's paid for, so that somebody's shareholders, whether, I don't want to name companies because I won't name them all, I'll get in trouble, but whether it's alcohol, guns, cigarettes, because they put the warning on the package, which hasn't really worked, decades ago. You can still, occasionally you'll see some smoking in the movies now, but it's still very, very rare. But I agree. Alcohol, it doesn't matter. Sitcom, military, law enforcement, firefighters, it doesn't matter. They're all drinking.
And that probably goes back a little bit to Prohibition and talking about that generational passing things down. Probably after Prohibition, everyone's like, nobody's stopping me from drinking anymore. And that's just been a mindset or mentality that's been handed down from generation to generation, and why it's still, even to this day, so prevalent in movies and television shows is because it was once oppressed.
Absolutely. Again, going back to my favorite author, Stephen R. Covey, his other book, The Eighth Habit, he talks about 3 birth gifts that we have. One of the first birth gifts he talks about is the freedom of choice. Mm-hmm. We all have the freedom of choice. And that's what separates us from the animal kingdom, right? They operate off instinct. We operate off, we have the ability to sit here and say, well, I don't want to do that, or I don't feel like doing it, or I want to do this instead. My instinct may be to run, but I'm not going to run. I'm going to stand and fight, or I'm going to do whatever, something different when my instinct kicks in. So now my question is this. As coaches, consultants, as authors of books around education, as we get near the top of the hour, what advice would you give? And I want each of you all to do this. What advice would you give our listening audience to say?
King is going to be back with us in just a moment or two. There you are. You're back. Good.
I'm gone? Oh, I didn't realize my connection was gone. I'm sorry.
No, so you said as coaches, consultants, and authors of books, and then it cut out. So we didn't get the actual question.
Okay, so as we reach the top of the hour, I want each of you all to share, what do you all think would be your advice? And I know it's a lot, but if you can kind of compact a nugget of wisdom to walk away with from the show, what advice would you say? How can someone be more fully human and connected, build fully human connections in today's world that we live in?
I'll start, and I said this earlier, and I truly believe this to be what we need in order to move past some of that money, power, greed, and be open to hearing each other and respecting one another, is being open to knowing that your personal biases or your life experience is limited to what you have experienced, that there is a whole world out there that's still to be discovered, that still holds many experiences that you've not yet had in your life. So acknowledging that and being aware of that is the first step into being open to expanding your knowledge and your understanding of the world, and understanding other people's perspectives is first coming to that awareness that you yourself is, and everyone truly is, limited in your knowledge and your understanding, and you need to be open to hearing other people's perspectives and experiences in order to continue yourself to grow and truly start to understand other aspects of the world and other people's experiences.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm going to just kind of step in and provide more of a based on that philosophy, which I 100% agree with, a more tactical, strategic way into that is two questions that I've had to teach myself, because on Myers-Briggs, I have a really big J and a very small P. So I judge everything, and I catch myself. I say, okay, take a breath. But two things. One is I ask myself on a daily basis, okay, what might I be missing here? What am I missing? Because especially if I'm going to get on a live broadcast to put my name on a book, I don't want to have too many mistakes. And the second one is, how can I listen generously to this person? So, and that's especially important when I disagree with someone. So that's an old philosopher's trick, listening generously. When somebody disagrees, give someone the benefit of the doubt, hear them out, and then ask questions rather than wagging my finger and saying you're wrong. So just what might I be missing, and how can I listen more generously and give someone the benefit of the doubt? So that's more tactical and strategic, but it's really, I think, Dr. Eccleston speaks to what you were pointing to. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I think if anything, you took my idea and then you expanded upon how you can actually do that. So I think that's fantastic.
That's because, like, in third grade, when you began speaking, my feeling I had was, oh man, she stole my answer. You know that feeling when you're in school? Yes. You're really ready to give a good answer, and then somebody before you, teacher says, oh yeah, you go, oh man.
Well, I think combined, it was fantastic because you helped elaborate where I missed that. So thank you for doing that.
Oh, you're welcome.
And thank you all both for your answers. And we have one more question, but I want to add my little part here. It's something I learned from Dr. Wayne Dyer. He says that there's a big difference between being right and doing the right thing. So I think if we focus on doing the right thing instead of being right, that's a first step toward being fully human in that context. And as we wrap things up, Dr. Eccleston, this is be new to you. And Reggie and I, we do this on every show. We ask each person to say one person and why you choose this individual, who you feel is an example of someone who's exhibiting, it can be past or present, fully human being behavior. And so if you want, we'll let you go first, or I can go first if we set the context.
Please, I need a second to process and think, because I feel I'm going through so many people in my mind. So yes, come to me last, please.
Okay, Reggie, I'll let you go ahead and go first, and I'll go second.
Yeah, I want to make sure I haven't used, all I've done is 2 or 3 times, and a couple of people are coming to mind. So I'll just mention the guy who was my hero growing up, and he's still alive. In fact, interesting, today is his 86th birthday. So it's Chris Christopherson. And some of you may think of him as a movie star. Some of you may not know who he is. But he began as a singer-songwriter, but fully human. He followed his parents requests and demands for his first 25 or 26 years. Rhodes Scholar, athlete, joined the Army, Ranger, volunteered for Vietnam. They didn't send him. But what he wanted to do was write songs. So he quit everything he had done, went to Nashville, became a janitor for 5 years, wrote songs, and eventually people began to record his music. And then he had his own career as a singer-songwriter. So he made that move of doing what he was told for his first 2.5 decades, and then stepped into what his soul called him to do. And he was successful at all of it. So for me, that was really fully human. And he gave me a sense of possibility when I was 16 that my cultural givens didn't give me. That was kind of long, sorry. Yeah.
No problem. No problem. I would say that my example of someone who was fully human, or they exhibited fully human, was Lady Diana.
Oh.
And
sorry, I'm having that 3rd grade moment where somebody steals your answer.
I had to think about that because I just recently watched a documentary about her and just how warm and caring and genuine she was. For someone to have as much power and whose culture was to say you're supposed to have this ego and walk around and think you're better than everyone else, and she didn't see herself as that. She saw herself as a human being, and she humbled herself. And there's this example when she walks through during the AIDS crisis, when AIDS was still very new to the world, and she walked in a hospital and she shook hands with all the AIDS patients to show that that's a myth and destroy that myth. So to me, I just wanted to honor her as a fully human individual.
That was a great answer. That was kind of where who I was coming up with as well. So, you know what, I'll piggyback on it and say that I think her job in doing that has trickled down to her sons, especially her son Harry, and I see him continuing to do a lot of that, especially I think taking himself and his family away from the monarchy and moving them here to this country, I'm sure was not an easy thing for him to do. And I'm sure there was a lot of backlash, but I think with that concept of trying to be fully human and do what's best for himself, for his family, mental health wise, and he continues his philanthropic pursuits and just helping others and really putting himself out there. I think her legacy continues to live on through her sons, and they continue to pick up her banner because it was so impactful and continue to do her work.
Well, thank you. And this has been our Fully Human Connections podcast. Thank you, Reggie. Thank you, Dr. Kristen Eccleston, for joining us on today's show. And thank you, listening audience. Thank you, Learning How, for tuning in. And we want to wish everyone a blessed and productive day. And let's all strive to continue to build and make fully human connections. Thank you.
Thank you, King. Bye-bye.